What can you buy with just $500? At a top-tier, luxurious classic car auction, that number wouldn't even cover the tip for a waiter. And yet, when Lucas Hartley steadfastly raised his bidding paddle to buy a rusted, shattered pile of scrap metal, laughter erupted across the VIP section. Isabella Crane, the powerful female CEO of the Crane Automotive Group, shot a disdainful glare in his direction, dropping a sharp, sarcastic remark loud enough for the entire hall to hear clearly. $500 for that pile of scrap. What are you going to do, grow flowers in it? The man in the grease-stained work clothes did not talk back. He simply gripped the tiny hand of his 7-year-old daughter tightly, quietly completing the transaction. But 30 days later, that pile of scrap silenced the entire city. Brew a cup of coffee, find a quiet space, and listen to the very last minute. Because what that single father did with that wrecked car will shatter every prejudice you hold about quiet people and completely redefine the word value. The following content is a work of fiction created for entertainment purposes. Any resemblance to actual persons, events, or locations is purely coincidental. Thank you for choosing to listen. We hope you enjoy the story and have a pleasant experience. The Westfield Classic Car Auction was an event where wealth was flaunted like a second skin. It was held annually at the Westfield Convention Center, a place that gathered big-time players, heavyweight collectors, and automotive investors from 3 states. The air in the hall was thick with the scent of expensive leather polish and the aroma of power. Gentlemen in tailored suits sipped champagne beside red velvet ropes. Ladies in high heels casually scrolled their phones between auction lots. On the center stage, 2 auctioneers controlled the pace of the ceremony with cold precision, the way people manage things when everyone sitting below has an excess of both patience and money. Here, not a single person bothered to rest their eyes on Lucas Hartley for more than 2 seconds. He stood squeezed in a side aisle, completely separated from the VIP section. His clothes were workwear, still carrying the faint, pungent smell of engine oil. He had a folding chair, but wasn't using it. Instead, his little daughter Grace sat perched on his shoulders. Her tiny sneakers rested against her father's chest, her large round eyes intently following every car wheeled out under the blazing spotlights. She wore a t-shirt printed with a cartoon gear, holding her own copy of the auction catalog diligently, using a purple marker to take notes on everything she observed. "That car has a cracked headlight, Dad." She pointed at a 1959 Chevrolet being pushed past. "Good eye," Lucas whispered softly in praise. He wasn't here for that Chevrolet. He didn't care about the 1963 Corvette that had just sold for $62,000, or the Jaguar E-Type that brought the entire hall to their feet in applause when the winning bid hit $90,000. Lucas came here for one singular goal, the final lot of the day, Lot 22. He had drawn a small circle around it with a pencil 3 days earlier, the moment he read the description in the catalog. And when he drew that circle, his hand was as steady as a rock. The auctioneer's voice took a dismal dive, losing all its enthusiasm as the floor crew pushed Lot 22 into position. The car had to be placed on a rolling platform because it couldn't roll on its own. It was completely dead. It was a 1967 Ford Mustang Fastback. It had been dumped in a dilapidated barn in rural Kentucky for roughly 22 years. The paint had peeled off in massive chunks, exposing mottled patches of gray primer and bare rusted metal underneath. The front bumper was cracked open and dangling halfway off. The windshield bore a long diagonal fracture, stretching from the lower left corner all the way to the upper right. The interior, from what could be seen through the hazy glass, had been chewed away by time and moisture into a mangled mess. The auctioneer read the vehicle's condition report in a flat, bored tone, exactly like someone reading a list of damages for an abandoned house no one expected to sell. A few people in the front row lazily stood up and stretched. Others turned on their heels and headed straight for the exit. Sebastian Voss, a tycoon sitting 3 seats away from Isabella Crane in the VIP area, leaned over and whispered a mocking joke. Isabella glanced briefly at the Mustang on the platform, clicked her tongue, and went back to staring at her phone screen. Lucas looked at the car, and he absolutely did not blink. "Opening bid is $200. The hall sank into the silence of disdain. The auctioneer repeated the number once more, but the muteness persisted. And then Lucas raised his paddle. $500, he said clearly. The auctioneer paused for a beat. Sir, the opening is $200. You can start there if you'd like. 500, Lucas repeated. Little Grace patted the top of her dad's head. Did we get it, Dad? Sebastian Voss was the first to laugh. It wasn't a hidden chuckle, but an obnoxious guffaw designed to drag the people around him into joining in, and a few of them actually did. Right after that, Isabella Crane, without even fully turning her head to look at Lucas, uttered the sentence that would haunt her mind for the next 30 days. $500 for that pile of scrap? What are you going to do? Grow flowers in it? The laughter erupting from the VIP section wasn't a violently cruel kind. It was the laughter of people who had never had to second-guess the value of $500. And it was the laughter of people who couldn't conjure up a single reason on earth to throw that money at a pile of scrap metal they'd have to pay a tow truck to haul away. It was contempt dressed up as entertainment. Lucas didn't even glance at Isabella. He looked up at Grace. The little girl didn't fully comprehend the malice behind those laughs, but she understood her father's face perfectly. His face at that moment was incredibly composed, as still as a windless lake. Seeing this, Grace maintained absolute tranquility as well. She trusted her father's face more than she trusted anything happening in this trashy room. Smack, the gavel came down. Lucas Hartley officially became the new owner of the 1967 Ford Mustang Fastback Lot 22 for $500. There was one thing those people laughing at Lucas had no idea about. 8 years ago, Lucas had been the head of restoration at Hollowell Classic Works, the most prestigious and respected classic car restoration workshop on the East Coast of the United States. The company's clients included private collectors whose names regularly graced billionaire business magazines, a national museum that religiously called for consultation twice a year, and 2 international auction houses that desperately requested dossiers from Hollowell to guarantee the provenance of their masterpieces. Lucas started there at the age of 22 as an apprentice technician and rapidly ascended to lead the entire restoration department before his 30th birthday. His veteran colleagues respectfully called him the Doctor, not because he was bureaucratic, but because he only needed to listen to an engine growl for 45 seconds to pinpoint its exact ailment even before popping the hood. However, everything collapsed on a Tuesday in March 4 years prior to the Westfield auction. His wife, Claire, was killed in a catastrophic traffic accident on the interstate outside Providence on a Saturday night. At the time, little Grace had just turned 3. For the 11 months following that tragedy, Lucas kept trying to work. He continued to grit his teeth and drive 2 hours every day to the Hollowell shop, still returning home when the sky was pitch black. He was faced with a little girl who desperately craved a complete father, but all she got in return was a robotic version of him, a father fulfilling his duties but whose soul was shattered and hollow. In the end, it was Grace who made the decision for him, in the way that children unconsciously choose, by expressing that she needed him by her side more than any achievement or money those distant commutes could bring. Lucas stepped back. He submitted his resignation and found a position as a mechanic at a smaller, more modest garage on the west side of Ashford. The work here was honest and uncomplicated. He fixed what needed fixing, charged a fair price, and was always home on time to cook dinner and check his daughter's homework. His reputation within the city's small classic car community was quiet but rock solid. Anyone who truly understood the mechanical industry knew the name Lucas Hartley. But those who just glanced at the surface only saw his shabby garage, his grease-stained clothes, and judged him as a lowly mechanic. And for them, that judgment was the end of the story. On the night of the auction, after coaxing Grace into a deep sleep, Lucas tiptoed and pulled out a small wooden box hidden beneath her bed. Grace knew this box existed and had been instructed never to open it without her father present. Inside the box was a black and white photograph printed on paper that had grown soft and yellowed at the edges due to the ravages of time. The photo captured a young man in his late 20s, standing proudly next to a car in front of a garage. The background was flat and arid looking. At the sky, it seemed to have been taken in Oklahoma. The car in the photo was none other than a Ford Mustang Fastback. Its paint, even depicted in black and white, exuded an incredibly unique quality. It acted like a surface that absorbed light rather than reflected it, a deep, mysterious, and deliberate color. The young man in the photo rested a hand on the roof, squinting slightly against the blazing sun. He carried the aura of someone who had just earned something monumental with his own hands and hadn't quite gotten used to the feeling of owning it. That young man was Joseph Hartley, Lucas's grandfather. The photo was taken in 1969. For the past 3 years, Lucas had always carried the vehicle's dossier associated with that photo. The original registration certificate, the factory build sheet, and the window sticker with the paint code printed in faded ink. That paint code clearly stated Acapulco Blue. The vehicle identification number, VIN, on those yellowed papers perfectly matched, digit for digit, the number stamped on the chassis of Lot 22 at the Westfield auction. Lucas had verified this match from the auction catalog right before he got in his car to drive to Westfield. He knew exactly what he was going there to buy long before he stepped through the auditorium doors. This was not some random garbage Mustang. This was his grandfather's car. Joseph had gritted his teeth and sold it in 1988, a dark year when the family was on the brink of bankruptcy and needed money to survive more than a sentimental car. He rarely spoke of it, and if he did, he only told it the way men do when referring to the most precious things they were forced to abandon. Kept it brief with evasive, teary eyes before hurriedly shifting to another topic. He never voiced any regrets because he didn't need to. The pain was already so clear. Grace suddenly stirred and appeared at the kitchen threshold. She was coming to get a glass of water when she caught her father sitting quietly at the table, the old photo and yellowed papers spread before him. "Is that the car from this morning, Dad?" she asked, rubbing her eyes. "That's right, sweetie. It's the one." "Is it Great-Grandpa's car?" "A very, very long time ago, honey," Lucas replied softly, setting the photo down on the table. "I'm going to bring it back to life." Grace considered this with all the seriousness of a 7-year-old child who had been taught by her father that every mechanical problem has its mechanical solution. "But are you sure you can fix it? It looked pretty broken." "Everything in this world can be fixed," Lucas smiled calmly. "The only issue is you just have to know where to start." The next morning, a flatbed tow truck dropped the Mustang corpse into Lucas's garage on Clement Street. A few neighbors walking by lingered out of curiosity. Under the sunlight that exposed every truth, the car looked exponentially worse. The paint peeled and festered. The chrome trim had oxidized into a dull, tarnished gray. The roof panel was warped and buckled at the rear seam. 20 minutes later, Aaron Mills pulled up in his truck. Aaron was 38, powerfully built, with shoulders as broad as a wrestler's. He had worked side by side with Lucas at Hollowell for 2 years before Lucas left. Currently, Aaron ran an incredibly lucrative auto upholstery and trim shop across town. Aaron walked silently around the Mustang twice without uttering a single word. He squatted down to examine the undercarriage, then slowly stood up straight. "You've got to be kidding me." Aaron frowned. 30 days, Lucas replied shortly. Aaron stared at him wide-eyed. 30 days? From this pile of scrap? 30 days? Aaron turned to look at the dead car once more. He took a deep breath, then decisively took off his jacket, tossing it onto a hook on the garage wall. "I'll be here on weekends, and don't you dare try to slip me a single dime of labor money." On the first day, Lucas didn't touch a single tool. He spent all that time purely on observation. He slowly walked around the machine, pressing his fingers against the body panels, lifting sections of trim to check the level of rust underneath, and testing the play of every door hinge. This was how he always started every project. Assessment must precede action. The working process must know its destination before it truly begins. And what he discovered completely turned this gloomy picture around. The chassis was entirely intact. Not just acceptable, but genuinely authentically intact. The frame rails weren't twisted. There was no significant structural corrosion. For a car that had lain dead, unsheltered for more than 2 decades, this was a miraculous discovery that any veteran restorer would recognize as priceless without needing to say a word. The body shell, however, was a tragedy. surface rust deformation on the right rear quarter panel, and the paint was completely dead. But the skeleton underneath was solid and incredibly honest. The heart of the machine was a 390 cubic inch V8 engine, FE block, one of the most tyrannical, powerful engines Ford ever equipped the 67 Fastback line with. It had been neglected miserably. The carburetor was seized solid with pitch-black sludge. The valve cover gaskets were torn to shreds. The timing chain was slack. But when Lucas carefully removed the cylinder heads and shone his flashlight inside, the cylinder walls weren't scored. The engine block wasn't cracked. It was an extensively traumatized engine, but it absolutely was not a dead one. And then a miracle appeared when Lucas disassembled the instrument cluster. Stuffed deep behind the dashboard was a piece of paper folded in half, the ballpoint pen ink slightly blurred from absorbing moisture over the years. Oklahoma, 1969. J. Hartley. Lucas stood motionless, staring blankly at the faded piece of paper in his hand for a long time. Then he carefully smoothed it out, tucked it neatly into his wallet, right next to his driver's license. That night he called his grandfather. On the other end of the line, Joseph picked up on the third ring, his voice timid and guarded, the caution of an old man not knowing who was calling. "I found it, Grandpa," Lucas choked out. The silence on the other end lasted so long that Lucas had to glance at his screen to make sure the call hadn't disconnected. Then his grandfather's voice rang out, whispering and trembling intensely. "Where is it, grandson?" "Westfield, Kentucky, Grandpa." "Before that?" "I don't know its entire journey, but right now, it's right here." Another silence enveloped them. Then the old man asked, his voice cracking, Is it very bad, my boy?" "It's bad, Grandpa," Lucas answered honestly, "but its core is still intact." When Lucas finished the call and returned to the living room, little Grace had fallen into a deep sleep on the sofa. He gently picked his daughter up and carefully laid her down in bed. He stood leaning against the doorframe for a moment, watching her steady, peaceful breathing while her tiny hand still loosely gripped the purple marker. He went back to the kitchen, took out a yellow notepad, and began drafting a grueling schedule. 5 days for complete disassembly, 3 days for cleaning, sorting, and assessment, 10 days for part sourcing and complete mechanical overhaul, 7 days for bodywork and reshaping, 4 days for paint, 2 days for interior upholstery and trim fitting, 2 days for final assembly system checks and road testing. Exactly 30 days. The math was feasible. It would drain him dry. It would be a living hell, but it could be done. The biggest challenge was the parts. Original specification components for a 1967 Mustang could still be bought, but hunting down the 100% correct items demanded a time budget that the 30-day schedule didn't allow him the luxury of. On the very first night, Lucas stayed up all night, calling 3 major suppliers, leaving voicemails for 2 others. He still maintained active VIP client accounts from his Hollowell days, and the name Lucas Hartley remained a golden guarantee that distributors instantly yielded to. By the end of the second day, he had locked down all the core components for the engine, pistons, camshafts, valve train, crankshaft, bearings, all committed to be delivered within his strict time frame. By the 6th day, Lucas personally drove to Callaway Auto Supply on the north side of Ashford to hunt for gaskets and a carburetor rebuild kit. The shop was run by Douglas Callaway, a veteran who had been tethered to the professional mechanic community for 31 years. He was the kind of guy who could evaluate a mechanic's caliber just through a few minor details, much like how a librarian recognizes an erudite reader. Lucas was standing picking out items in front of the Mustang parts shelf when a woman walked through the door. He heard the customer chime, but didn't bother turning around, his eyes still glued to the specs printed on a box. Isabella Crane walked up to the checkout counter. She was negotiating with Douglas about finding a display component for Crane Automotive's launch event of their new heritage-inspired sedan. She insisted on finding a historically accurate part simply to serve as a prop for a promotional photograph. She spoke with decisiveness and clarity, the rhythm of someone used to wielding absolute power in any room. Douglas patiently answered her questions, then suddenly tipped his chin toward Lucas, who was standing with his back to them. You know, Douglas said leisurely, with the relaxed tone of someone who had lived more than half his life in this shop and wasn't afraid of offending anyone. That gentleman looking at Mustang parts over there? He has personally restored cars for the Smithsonian National Museum and for the Christie's auction house in London, too. Isabella froze and turned around. For the first time, she looked at Lucas, not with the disdain reserved for a pauper, but with the eyes of an expert scrutinizing another expert. She looked at him as a fact to be assessed, rather than a piece of trash to be dismissed. Lucas was still busy reading the back of the carburetor kit box, not fully turning around. He merely tilted his head slightly, giving Douglas a small nod of greeting. That was all. Isabella bought what she needed and hurriedly left. Standing on the sidewalk, she paused in front of the glass door, staring at Lucas's back for a long time before getting into her car. At the checkout counter earlier, she hadn't recognized him, but when Douglas mentioned the name Hartley, her brain instantly clicked. She had heard that name in the context of the luxury classic car restoration industry at a conference 2 years ago. Back then, they were discussing the strict provenance requirements for a classic car that had just been successfully auctioned for over $1.2 million. And the entire restoration work of that masterpiece was credited to the hands of a master named Hartley from Hollowell Classic Works. She sat dead silent in her car for a moment, then slammed the gas pedal straight back to her office. That very afternoon, Isabella ordered her assistant to dig up every professional record related to the name Lucas Hartley, former employee of Hollowell, currently residing in Ashford. The report placed on her desk was a dazzling resume, so magnificent that it completely contradicted the image of the sullen man at the Westfield auction. The Smithsonian Project. The original dossier for Christie's, a notorious private collection in Monaco. A completed restoration project evaluated by an independent appraiser whose report clearly stated with a staggering conclusion, technically and historically, this is the most magnificent and faithful work of its kind completed in the last 15 years. Late that afternoon, Sebastian Voss happened to swing by Isabella's office door. He had just caught wind from his cronies at the auction hall that the crazy guy from that day was actually cleaning up and fixing that Mustang scrap pile in some shabby garage in Ashford. He laughed uproariously, recounting the story, but Isabella wasn't laughing. "Who is he?" she asked coldly. Sebastian repeated what he just said. "He's a lowly mechanic, a stupid guy who spent $500 to buy a pile of garbage." "No, I mean before that," Isabella growled. "Before becoming someone like that, who was he?" Sebastian looked bewildered, shaking his head in ignorance. Shrewd enough to recognize the killing intent in her eyes, he slipped away, understanding the conversation was over. Isabella stared at Lucas's brilliant resume on her computer screen for a long while. Then she quietly closed it and went back to work. The following weeks inside Lucas's garage on Clement Street were weeks that drained a person's soul. Those days weren't labeled as historic days while they were happening. They were woven from mornings waking up before the sun, broke late nights of meticulous labor, and the sacred silence of a man giving his all to do a job he knew perfectly well how to do without needing an audience to cheer him on. Every afternoon after school, Grace would go out to the garage, sitting at a folding table in the corner to do her homework. Occasionally, she would look up, ask about the names of parts, or offer observations with absolute seriousness. "The color of this door panel is wrong, Dad," she exclaimed on a Wednesday evening in the second week, holding up a dry, peeling flake of paint she found on the floor right next to the passenger door. Lucas took the paint flake. "What color do you think it should be?" "Blue," she answered. "Like in Great-Grandpa's picture, a dark blue like the ocean at night." He looked at his daughter and smiled. "You are absolutely right." The paint color was the toughest puzzle he had anticipated from the start. Acapulco blue, the original factory color code clearly stated on Grandpa Joseph's build sheet, was an extremely rare color option, exclusive to the 67 and 68 Mustangs. Ford's original mixing formula was still in technical archives, but modern dyes had drastically changed compared to the 1960s. Not a single commercial paint supplier in Ashford could mix a color code that perfectly matched the original swatch Lucas held in his hand. He called 3 professional paint mixing shops in 2 different cities. None could replicate the absolute precision he desired. One evening, he pulled out an old binder from his Hollowell days. It contained top-secret technical documents, factory color parameters, and mixing ratios he had compiled over nearly a decade in the restoration trade. The formula for Acapulco Blue was on page 47, cross-referenced with a DuPont product code, a color code that had been permanently discontinued since 1991. Using the original formula archived colorimetry data and a spectrophotometer Aaron borrowed from an auto painting expert, Lucas mixed the paint himself. 2 full days of continuous mixing, testing, and adjusting. When he held the test panel right next to the black and white photo, comparing the depth of the paint layer with the tonal quality of the historical image, the match was magically perfect. Aaron picked up the test panel, held it out at arm's length, and remained speechless for a full minute. "Lucas," Aaron finally spoke, his voice thick. "I know that. One way or another, Isabella Crane is going to see this car. You know that." Lucas didn't reply. He was already busy prepping the spray booth. The engine block was fully assembled during the 2nd and 3rd weeks. For a master mechanic, this process went smoothly, not because it was easy, but because every movement was ingrained in his subconscious, leaving no room for hesitation. Lucas replaced every broken component and restored every tiny detail to exact original factory specs. The 390FE engine block was cleaned, honed, and reassembled with a meticulousness and reverence that amateurs could never perceive. But anyone who truly understood machinery would instantly hear once the engine roared. On the 14th night, he turned the ignition key for the first time. The engine sputtered and coughed after 2 tries. The RPMs were jerky and uneven, then slowly stabilized after about 40 seconds into a steadier rhythm. It wasn't perfect yet. The carburetor needed fine-tuning. The ignition timing was slightly off, but it ran. A 60-year-old engine block lying dead without a breath for over 2 decades was now roaring loudly in a small garage on Clement Street, Ashford, at 11:40 at night. Aaron grabbed his head, looking up at the ceiling in pure shock. Little Grace, who had fallen asleep on the folding table, her cheek resting on her homework notebook, jerked her head up at the noise. "What did the car just say, Dad?" she asked, blinking her eyes. Lucas turned to look at his daughter, his eyes sparkling. "It said, it still remembers us." She believed it without a hint of doubt, slowly resting her head back down on the table and going back to sleep. The bodywork lasted from day 15 to day 22. The right rear section was the most torturous area to endure. The dent required heating, reshaping, and countless rounds of finish sanding before the surface met the insane standard Lucas imposed. Close your eyes, run your hand across the surface in dim light, and if you feel even the slightest ripple, do it all over again. The rust treatment process was executed systematically. The primer application went through 3 rigorous stages. Not a single step was skipped just because time was running out. Day 26. The Acapulco Blue paint was officially applied. Lucas sprayed the first coat in the afternoon and the second coat the next morning. The paint spread evenly across the body shell, exactly like the way a truth is exposed after being hidden. Nothing to be surprised about. It was simply an acknowledgement. The deep blue, with a hint of metallic flake from the secret formula, caught the brilliant light exactly as it had shined in 1967. Just as it had caught the blazing sun when Grandpa Joseph Hartley stood beside it in Oklahoma years ago. On day 27, Aaron arrived for the final buffing and surface finishing. He walked into the garage, froze right at the threshold, and stood rooted there, speechless, for almost a minute. "Say something, will you?" Lucas urged. "I'm trying to find a word that's worthy," Aaron muttered. "Give me a minute." The interior was the final stage. Lucas managed to hunt down period-correct materials to reupholster the seats, a perfect replica of the original black vinyl Ford used for the '67 Fastback. He painstakingly installed the new door panels, laid the carpet, and reattached the dashboard components over 3 grueling days. The central instrument cluster was the last thing to go in. Before screwing it into place, he flipped the back of the dashboard panel over. This panel was the piece that had accompanied the car since it rolled out of the factory in Dearborn. It had witnessed the moment Joseph Hartley drove the car out of the dealership in Oklahoma City in the spring of 1967, and there the crude, hand-carved mark was still intact. J. Hartley. Lucas did not restore it. He didn't polish over it, didn't fill it with putty, nor treat it as a flaw to be hidden. He carefully wiped away the dirt around it, then reverently placed the instrument cluster back into its original position, keeping his grandfather's carved name exactly where it belonged. Day 29. An express letter arrived from the organizing committee of the Ashford Vintage Automotive Showcase, the city's largest and most prestigious classic car exhibition held annually at Ashford Convention Park. The letter announced that the event would take place this Saturday, and a special display spot had been reserved exclusively for an incredibly outstanding vehicle they had just received information about. The committee cordially invited Lucas to display the car in the center exhibition area, a prime location normally determined only by the strict selection of the judging panel and never available for open registration. Lucas read the letter twice. Then he handed it to Grace, who was eating her cereal for breakfast. "They want to see our car, Dad," she cheered. "Looks like it. Is the car ready, Dad?" Lucas looked out toward the garage door. "Almost done, sweetie." He had no idea who had secretly contacted the organizing committee. He didn't bother asking either. What he would never know and only realize much, much later was that Isabella Crane herself had personally made that phone call. 2 days after she dug up his professional records and read the appraisal report from the Monaco collection, Isabella contacted the committee through a middleman. She gently suggested that a car of extraordinary technical and historical value existed, and it entirely deserved to be placed in the center exhibition spot. She absolutely did not mention her connection to the Westfield auction. She didn't breathe a word to Sebastian, her assistant, or anyone at Crane Automotive Group. She just picked up the phone, made the call, and went back to work. The final night. Lucas and Aaron performed the final tweaks, adjusting the idle mixture, tweaking the ignition timing, retorquing the suspension. When the clock struck 2:15 a.m., the work was officially finished. Both men were utterly exhausted. Lucas sat flat on the garage floor, his back against the tool cabinet. Aaron slumped on the opposite side near the door. Neither said a word to the other. The Mustang stood proudly in the center under the floodlights. The Acapulco blue paint reflected light with a profound, quiet depth, exactly the way it had shined in 1967. Every surface was flawless. Every curve was sharp and exactly where it should be. From the gleaming chrome trim, the sloping fastback roofline, to the re-chromed grille, from the period-correct fog light bezels to the matte black rear taillight panel. The car had been reborn with absolute fidelity to its original design. A masterpiece forged from 30 years of restoration experience packed into 30 sweat-drenched days. Aaron slowly stood up, grabbing his jacket hanging on the door hook. He stared intently at the car for a long time before putting it on. 30 days, Aaron murmured, from a $500 pile of scrap. Lucas, do you realize how great of a thing you just created? Lucas looked at the car. Then he looked up at the black and white photo of Grandpa Joseph Hartley he had taped to the garage wall 3 weeks ago. The photo was still there, the corner of the paper slightly curled. "I brought it home," he replied softly. An hour later, he carried Grace to bed. She woke up startled when the garage lights clicked off and asked in a sleepy voice, "Is the car done, Dad?" "All done, my love," he whispered. "Tomorrow we're taking it to the show." "That's good," she mumbled, falling asleep before her back even hit the mattress. Saturday morning woke up crisp and dry, carrying the signature light of October weather. The perfect light for photographers and incredibly flattering for car paint. Ashford Convention Park, a sprawling 6-acre ground on the north side of the city, was already packed with over 80 gorgeous machines by 8 a.m. Sports cars, luxury touring cars, pre-war roadsters, and muscle cars from the 60s and 70s, all proudly displayed on clean asphalt under pristine white canopies. Lucas personally drove the Mustang away from Clement Street toward the park. This was the first time the car had rolled under its own power on public streets since before little Grace was born. The 390 V8 engine roared with the exact authoritative sound it was built to produce, a deep, commanding growl, not flashy, but powerful enough to make other drivers turn their heads when crossing an intersection or proactively slow down out of respect when merging onto the highway. Grace sat in the passenger seat wearing a denim jacket, her hair in a high ponytail, clutching the 1969 photo in her lap with both hands. "Our car is the loudest one on the road, Dad," she exclaimed excitedly. "It has a big engine, sweetie," Lucas replied. "I love it." The little girl beamed. The staff at the exhibition gate immediately directed Lucas straight to the center exhibition area, the geometric heart of the entire event, where all pathways from the 4 main gates converged. He hadn't been informed in advance of this ultimate privilege. Lucas parked and turned off the engine. In the moment of silence after the engine stopped roaring, a man standing 20 feet away abruptly turned to look at the car. Then the man next to him turned too. And within a mere 2 minutes, a massive crowd of dozens of people had swarmed the Mustang in a stunned semicircle without anyone coordinating them. Grace stepped out of the car, standing next to the front fender, still holding the photo. A veteran collector, a gentleman in his 60s named Raymond Aldis, who had attended this event for the past 19 years and who had visited Hollowell Classic Works twice when Lucas was head of restoration, stepped forward. He examined the car with the quiet, sharp scrutiny of an old fox who had looked at too many cars and was more than capable of distinguishing between a car made to look pretty and a car restored to standard. He crouched down to inspect the rear wheel arch. He stood up and walked to the front. He asked to open the hood and stared at the engine bay for a very long time. Then he stood up straight, looked right into Lucas's eyes, and proactively reached out his hand. "Lucas Hartley, I kept wondering what the hell you were up to these days." He paused for a beat. "Now I understand." A female reporter from the Ashford Times was wandering the grounds writing an article for the weekend culture section. She had received a tip the day before that an incredibly notable masterpiece would appear at the exhibition, a car tied to a story that had been storming the car enthusiast community since the Westfield auction. She quickly found the Mustang thanks to the swarming crowd. She snapped photos continuously, then approached Grace. The little girl was enthusiastically recounting the car's history to a boy her age with the confidence of someone who had memorized every historical fact. "This was my great-grandpa's car," Grace said proudly. "He bought it in 1967. My dad found it and fixed it. It took exactly 30 days. This color is called Acapulco blue." The boy nodded seriously. "What's Acapulco?" Grace thought for a second. "It must be a place with a very blue color," she answered innocently. Isabella Crane arrived at the exhibition at 10:45 a.m., later than expected. She came in her capacity as the senior executive representative of Crane Automotive Group, the event's diamond sponsor. She strode past the booths with her assistant and 2 communications staff in tow. She was all too familiar with events like this. She knew exactly how cars were usually displayed, where crowds usually gathered, and how the event's pace unfolded. But the center exhibition area today carried an entirely unusual atmosphere. From 40 yards away, she could see a massive crowd, denser and more highly concentrated than any other corner of the grounds surrounding a single car. She walked toward it. The crowd automatically parted to make way as she approached, the way crowds always yield to those carrying the aura of power. And then the gap was wide enough for her to see the entire car. The Acapulco blue paint dealt a critical blow, knocking her out right on the spot. Not just because the color itself was so magnificent in the morning sun, displaying the exact depth and elite quality of the 1967 formula that most modern restoration attempts failed miserably to achieve. What defeated her was the total perfection of this masterpiece. The flawless proportions of the fastback roofline on the perfectly straightened body shell. The chrome trim gleamed with the purity of a brand-new item. The open hood showcased the 390 FE engine block, clean, sharp, and precise down to every bolt, as if it had just been assembled yesterday on the factory line, rather than restored in a shabby garage over the last 30 days. She had seen this car at Westfield. She vividly remembered its hideous shape, the peeling, festering paint, the cracked windshield, the dangling front bumper, the dilapidated exterior of a piece of trash that life had thrown away. The thing standing proudly before her now, though, occupying the same physical space in her memory, was an entirely foreign entity. It was not repaired, it was returned. Returned to its very original soul with absolute technical fidelity by the magic hands of someone who truly knew what he was doing. Reaching a realm she hadn't even bothered to consider when she looked at him with disdain in his grease-stained overalls carrying his daughter on his shoulders at Westfield. Sebastian Voss was standing right to her left. He had seen the car, then seen Lucas standing next to it, and he had been completely mute ever since. Isabella stepped through the remaining space, walking straight up to the front of the car. Lucas saw her from about 10 steps away. He didn't step back. He didn't change his facial expression or posture. He just stood there and waited, as calm as he had been when the auction gavel came down at Westfield. She stopped at the nose of the car. She ran her eyes from the front to the rear, a slow, comprehensive look measuring every single detail. Then she looked up at Lucas. "How long?" she asked. 30 days. From that pile of trash at Westfield. That's right. A silence enveloped them. Little Grace curiously stepped closer to her father, looking up at Isabella with clear, curious eyes, devoid of any complex judgment. Isabella looked down at the child for a moment. "I said some very terrible things at the auction," Isabella spoke up. Her voice had completely shifted tone from when she was in the boardroom. It was no longer sharp, but more direct and sincere. "Those words were truly cruel to you and to the little girl." She looked straight at Grace. "I am sorry." Lucas gave a slight nod. He didn't say another word. He didn't use any empty cliches to close the distance faster than necessary. He just nodded, and that nod was more than enough. Grace, with absolute innocence, replied clearly, "It's okay, ma'am. My dad said that mean words are usually spoken by people who haven't taken a careful look at things yet." Isabella stared at the child, stunned. A strange expression flashed across her face, not quite a smile nor anything else. It was the expression of a powerful person who had just received a well-deserved lesson from a source they never expected. Exactly at 12 noon, the showcase judging panel officially announced the results under the grand canopy near the entrance. The crowd gathered around the podium with the eagerness of people who had spent an entire morning immersed in mechanical art. The award for Best in Show went to 1967 Ford Mustang Fastback Center Exhibition Area owner Lucas Hartley. The award for Best Restoration continued to call the same name, the very same car. The judging panel's representative read the citation loudly over the microphone. A comprehensive restoration project from a non-operational scrap state executed in just 30 days using historically accurate components and techniques representing the highest standard of craftsmanship the panel has witnessed in the 22-year history of this event. A round of applause erupted from the edges of the crowd and rapidly spread to the center. Grace jumped up, hugging her father's arm in joy. Lucas stood silently, his arms hanging at his sides, looking up at the podium, then looking down at the black and white photo his daughter was still holding tightly. In that photo, his grandfather at age 29 was standing next to this very car in a different decade, with the same humble posture of a man who had earned something great with his own hands and hadn't quite gotten used to owning it. Aaron had secretly driven to Oklahoma City last Thursday without telling anyone the purpose of his trip. He only told Lucas he had some errands and would be back on Saturday morning. He showed up at the exhibition right before noon, accompanied by a special passenger, a 67-year-old man with silver-white hair leaning on a cane, walking slowly across the asphalt. He wore a slightly outdated formal suit compared to the event's nature, but his leather shoes had been polished to a brilliant shine with the utmost care since early morning. Joseph Hartley parted the crowd and stepped in, freezing the moment the car came into sight. He stood rooted there for a very, very long time. Long enough for the people around him to notice the anomaly and automatically step back to give him space without being asked. He slowly walked forward, raising a trembling hand and pressed it flat against the hood of the Mustang, right over the engine block, right at the spot where a man usually places his hand when the thing he's touching is something he's held in his mind for a quarter of a century. The corners of his eyes were red and teary. Grace ran over, hugging her great-grandfather's waist. "Great-grandpa, look at your car! My dad fixed it. It only took exactly 30 days. Joseph Hartley embraced his little great-granddaughter with one arm, while his other hand remained glued to the hood. He choked up, unable to speak. When he found his voice, the words he uttered were so small and quiet that only those standing right next to him could hear. "I know, my sweet girl," he wept. "I know." Lucas stood next to his grandfather and didn't say a word. There was nothing left that needed to be said. The car was here. The 3 generations of his family were here. That was the most complete statement. Isabella stood watching from a respectful distance. Her assistant started to say something, but Isabella gently raised a hand, a silent signal meaning, "Not right now." She stared intently at Joseph Hartley's hand resting on the hood and fell deep into thought. Meanwhile, Sebastian Voss had slinked away from the grounds 40 minutes earlier. He left without bothering to shake anyone's hand. Late in the afternoon, when the award ceremonies concluded and the crowd gradually thinned out, leaving only those who lingered out of genuine passion, Isabella found Lucas standing near the nose of the Mustang, while little Grace sat in the passenger seat, enthusiastically explaining the dashboard gauges to the veteran collector Raymond Aldous through the rolled-down window. "I'd like to discuss something with you," Isabella spoke up, "whenever you have the time." Lucas stood waiting. "Crane Automotive is preparing to open a heritage division," she said, "specializing in classic car restoration and certification. We have massive capital and an elite client network, but we lack the expertise." She paused for a beat, and that pause carried a rare caution from a powerful businesswoman. "And I think today I have found it." Lucas looked at her with a steady gaze. "How would that work look? That is what I care about if you want to make an offer." He fell silent for a moment. Then he cast his eyes over the Mustang's hood toward his grandfather. Joseph was now sitting in the driver's seat, his old hands resting on the original steering wheel, looking through the windshield into an endless void, with an expression that could only be described by one word: peace. "My condition is, the work must be in Ashford," Lucas said, "and I must be home before dinner." "I understand," Isabella replied. "Then we can talk," he said. He didn't agree. He also didn't refuse. He merely opened a door for negotiation, and that was the most standard answer for this moment. Measured, sincere, and promising nothing beyond a conversation. The sun began to set. Ashford Convention Park sank into the characteristic quiet of an event winding down. Folding tables were being dismantled. Car owners were taking final souvenir photos. The October sun cast long, sweeping shadows across the asphalt. The Mustang parked proudly in the center space, bathing in the last rays of the day. The Acapulco blue paint shifted to a warmer hue as the angle of light changed. That paint retained its mesmerizing depth at 4 p.m., just exactly as it had at 10 a.m., which was the most solid proof of a flawless paint job. Aaron drove his truck parallel to Lucas on the way back to Clement Street. Little Grace had fallen asleep, her head resting against the car window right from the first intersection. Grandpa Joseph's photo still lay obediently on her lap, her tiny hand resting lightly on it to protect it. Joseph sat in Aaron's truck, blissfully gazing at the street scenes of Ashford in the twilight. Lucas drove in the special tranquility of a man who had just fulfilled the greatest wish of his life. The engine block growled right beneath him with the solid, calm authority that he had personally reborn for it. He listened to it the way he always listened to engines. searching in those sounds not just for dry mechanical parameters, but for the confirmation that everything had been put back right where it belonged. He suddenly recalled Isabella's disparaging words at Westfield. $500, pile of scrap, grow flowers. Those words were incredibly cruel, and their purpose was to humiliate. But in some unintentional way, they turned out to be incredibly useful. Not as an impulsive motivation to prove himself, but as a clarity. On the 12th day, when that damn engine refused to start for the third time, when Aaron had gone home, when Grace was fast asleep, when the garage felt too vast and the 30-day deadline seemed to be suffocating him, it was that clarity that saved him. The steadfastness of knowing what he was doing and why he had to do it kept his hands moving forward. There are things in this world that are undervalued, not because they lack value, but because the person making the appraisal didn't bother to look long enough, deep enough, or carefully enough. The car was one of those things, and he had always vaguely realized that he himself was probably one of them too. He turned onto Clement Street. The garage lights were still on. Aaron must have forgotten to turn them off when he picked Joseph up this morning. The roll-up door was wide open, the lights casting a rectangular yellow patch onto the driveway. Lucas slowly steered the Mustang into that patch of light and turned off the engine. The silence that rushed in after the engine stopped roaring was a very good kind of silence. The silence that only appears when a machine that inherently always has to run perfectly is finally allowed to rest. He sat silently for a moment in the driver's seat. Then he gently opened the door, lifted Grace out of the car without waking her, and carried his daughter toward the house. Standing at the threshold, he turned his head to look back one last time. Grandpa Joseph was standing next to the car in the garage. His old hand rested on the roof, not moving, not saying a word. He just stood there in the exact posture of a person standing beside something they thought was lost forever, now returned to them. A sacred stillness of someone who didn't want to rush to break the moment because they understood that some moments in this world will never come twice. The car had returned home, and the man who brought it back smiled and turned to walk inside. The garage lights remained on for a long while more.